Welcome to In-Silico Trials Real Impact, the In-Silico UK podcast that's revolutionizing the way we think about medical innovation. I'm Professor Alejandro Frangi from the University of Manchester, and I'll be your guide through this fascinating world of In-Silico technologies. In each episode, we'll dive into cutting-edge research and groundbreaking news that are shaping the future of medical product development and regulation. From computational modeling to simulated clinical trials, we are exploring how digital approaches are transforming healthcare, making it safer, more efficient, more equitable, and incredibly precise. So, whether you're a researcher, regulator, a member of the public, or a patient representative, or simply curious about the future of medicine, tune in as we unravel the complex world of in-silico methods and their real-world impact. Get ready to discover how computer-simulated trials are leading to very real breakthroughs in patient care. In-Silico Trials Real Impact, where algorithms and data are saving lives. Let's begin.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving deep into a pretty hefty document, the Sudlow Review. But it has some really interesting conclusions about how health data is used in the UK. So we're going to try to break it down today and figure out just what it means for the future of healthcare research.
Yeah, the timing of this is quite interesting, isn't it? We've just come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we really saw how powerful data could be in fast-tracking research and treatments. And I think the Sudlow Review is all about trying to apply those lessons learned to other health challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely a hot topic. So jumping right into it, one of the things the review talks about is this idea of a data deluge, right? Like every second, tons of health information is being generated from, GP visits to hospital stays, prescriptions. But the problem is that a lot of this data is siloed off and difficult to access.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where the real potential lies, isn't it? Like in linking these data sets together. One example they give in the review is about combining ethnicity data. So, from GP records and hospital records, and they managed to achieve 95% completeness just by combining those two. And I think that kind of detailed information, it's absolutely crucial if we want to be able to understand health disparities and really tailor our treatments to specific population groups.
So by linking the data, you're getting a much more complete picture of like a person's health and helps researchers get more accurate results. But on the other hand, the review talks a lot about the frustrations that researchers actually face in trying to use this data. Like, what are some of the things that they're running up against?
Yeah, well, as you said, the UK's health data system is notoriously complex and inefficient. The review even cites a research team that needed 2.5 years just to link data from 5 data sets. And it's these kinds of delays that really hinder vital research.
2.5 years? That's crazy. How do they expect, timely research to happen with those kinds of delays? So we have all this potential, but clearly a lot of roadblocks. What does the Sudlow Review, propose we do to actually fix this?
Well, there are 5 key recommendations that they lay out. The first, and probably the most crucial, is this idea of making health data a critical national infrastructure.
So treating it with the same kind of importance that we would say our transport systems or our energy systems.
Exactly. They argue that health data needs to be viewed as essential to the well-being of the nation. And we need to have, a long-term strategy, sustainable funding to really manage it effectively.
So it's really like a fundamental shift in our mindset and approach, and not just about, throwing money at the problem, which obviously is important.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there needs to be a bigger change.
Yeah, for sure. And so the second recommendation builds on that and calls for a national health data service to be set up. And the idea here is it would act as a central hub, streamlining data access and providing support for researchers.
So really simplifying the process and making this data much more readily available.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, while ensuring, that all the privacy and security issues are maintained, which I think is, a really delicate balancing act. Public trust is so paramount, And the review also highlights that, while most people do actually support the use of their data if it's for, societal benefit, there are still these strong concerns about, privacy and security and potential misuse.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I think, anyone who would want to know, how is my data being used? Who has access to it?
Yeah.
So how does the Sudlow Review address those kinds of concerns?
Well, they really emphasize the need for ongoing public engagement. And I think it needs to be more than just, transparency. The public really needs to be involved in shaping policy and data governance frameworks. It can't just be a one-way street. We have to inform people, but we also have to listen to their concerns and incorporate that feedback into the system.
So two-way street.
Hmm.
The public has a voice, and the system needs to be accountable.
Yeah, I think that sums it up very well. And I think this leads us quite nicely to the fourth recommendation, which is about having a consistent approach to data access and governance,
Yeah.
Across all 4 nations of the UK. Because currently there are these variations in regulations and processes which can create, inconsistencies and just make it really difficult to, conduct research on a national scale.
Yeah, so trying to streamline things across, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I mean, that sounds like a huge undertaking,
Yeah.
especially given that, the healthcare systems are all different.
It is. But the review argues it's crucial because we need to make sure that everyone benefits from the insights that the data can provide, that the system is as efficient as possible.
Okay. And what about that final recommendation?
So the 5th one is about establishing this UK-wide system for standards and accreditation of secure data environments. So those are the highly controlled systems where researchers can access and analyze sensitive data. And it's basically about making sure that there is a consistent level of security, across the board and just building trust in how data is being handled.
So it's kind of like a stamp of approval, right? Like a quality assurance mark that signals that, these environments meet certain standards for protecting data.
Precisely. It's about giving researchers and the public the confidence that data is being handled with, the utmost care and responsibility.
I mean, this is all incredibly important stuff and honestly a lot to take in. What stands out to you as the most significant takeaway so far?
I think what's really powerful about the Sudlow review is that it's not just offering a technical solution. It's trying to present this vision for a more ethical and transparent data ecosystem. It recognizes that data has this huge potential to revolutionize healthcare and research, but it also really emphasizes the need to protect privacy and maintain public trust. It's all about finding that balance, and ensuring that ultimately the system serves everyone's needs.
Yeah, I love that point about, it's not just about having the data, but it's how we're actually using it, right?
Yeah.
And making sure it benefits, society as a whole. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, but I'm already I want to hear more about how these recommendations could actually be put into practice.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of practical considerations and nuances that we haven't even touched upon.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll have to get into that in part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll delve a little bit deeper into those practical aspects and discuss, what kind of impact this could have on the future of healthcare in the UK.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Sudlow review.
It's great to be back. So we've laid out these 5 key recommendations, but now I kind of want to get into the nitty gritty of how they might actually play out in the real world. And I think a good place to start is with that first big idea, making health data a critical national infrastructure. I mean, it sounds great, in theory, but what kind of concrete steps would actually need to be taken to make that happen?
Well, I think it starts with a real mindset shift, right? The review's really arguing that we can't just treat health data as an afterthought or something that's, just for researchers. It needs to be kind of woven into the fabric of the NHS and, the broader healthcare ecosystem.
So more like a core utility,
Mhm.
like electricity or clean water,
Mm.
something that everybody just understands is essential.
Exactly. And that means it requires a coordinated effort from all the, key players involved. So NHS England, research institutions, government bodies, the whole shebang. They really call for a joint strategy that sets out, clear goals and priorities and, investment plans.
Right. Because without that kind of shared vision, things can easily just fall apart.
Right.
It can't just be a few enthusiastic people pushing for change. It needs to be baked into the system.
Yeah, for sure. And I think funding is a huge part of that as well. The review highlights that, in the past, investment in health data infrastructure, it's been very sporadic. So we need a more predictable, sustainable funding stream if we want to make sure that these systems can actually be, built properly and maintained.
Because you can't really build a very strong infrastructure on shaky ground. That makes sense. But it's not just about the technical side of things, right? The review also emphasizes the need for expertise, and skilled personnel to actually manage and analyze this data.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point, I think. We need more data scientists, more analysts, and also more people trained in things like, data governance and ethics. Building that workforce is as important as building the technical infrastructure itself.
Right, because you could have the fanciest system in the world, but if you don't have people who know how to, use it responsibly and actually extract those meaningful insights,
Yeah.
then it's not really going to get you very far.
Yeah, precisely. And this kind of leads us quite nicely, I think, into that second recommendation about establishing this national health data service. And how do we actually move from this fragmented, kind of confusing system we have now to something that's, more streamlined and efficient?
Yeah. I mean, that's the million-pound question, isn't it? I mean, you kind of envision this service as like a central hub that would just simplify the whole data access thing for researchers. But I mean, I imagine there are some like pretty huge logistical challenges there.
Oh, yeah, there are. And the review does actually acknowledge that. This wouldn't be about creating one massive database. It's more about developing a system that actually connects those existing data sources, but in a secure and interoperable way.
Okay. So it's more about like building bridges, not, bulldozing everything and starting again from scratch.
Exactly. They suggest it could be led by, like senior executive leader, someone with the authority to actually cut through all that red tape and, drive progress.
Yeah, someone to like champion the cause and really get everyone on board.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. But even with a strong leader, in a well-designed system, you still need that public trust. Like the review really highlights how important that is. And how do we actually go beyond just like informing people about what's happening and actually actively engaging them and shaping, the future of health data?
And I think that's where this third recommendation comes in. This ongoing and coordinated engagement with, patients, the public health professionals, and policymakers. It's about, moving beyond just, having one-off consultations and actually creating a continuous, dialogue.
So not just like ticking a box, right? But actually listening to people's concerns and suggestions and actually responding to them.
Yeah, exactly. And they recommend lots of different approaches, things like public forums, citizen juries, even incorporating, patient representatives into data governance bodies. The key is making people feel heard and, that their perspectives are actually being considered.
Right. Because, I mean, without that, any system, even if it's well-intentioned, it's likely to encounter resistance if people don't feel like they're part of it, right? They need to feel like they're part of the solution, not just subjects in some, giant data experiment.
Yeah. And I completely agree. And it's not just about addressing concerns. It's also about harnessing, the collective intelligence of the public as well. People have such valuable insights into their own health and, into the healthcare system. And we need to be able to tap into that knowledge.
That's a good point. It's kind of about recognizing that patients are experts in their own right.
Yeah.
And, the fourth recommendation focuses on setting this like UK-wide approach to data access and governance. And I think it's really interesting because, currently each nation has its own system. Yeah. And that can be really confusing, right? And make it really difficult to do, research on a national scale. So how do we like bridge those divides without kind of, trampling on each nation's autonomy?
Yeah, it's a very tricky balance. And the review isn't actually calling for a completely, homogenous system. It's more about having greater alignment on like the core principles and processes.
So finding like that common ground, but still respecting those, individual differences.
Yeah, exactly. And, the focus should be on streamlining the data access processes, right? And making sure that those security and privacy standards, they're consistent across the UK. And that would make it much easier for researchers to actually work with, data from different regions. And it would allow, for these larger scale studies that can actually benefit, the entire population.
So it's really about maximizing the value of our like collective data resources. That makes sense. So now let's talk about that final recommendation, which focuses on secure data environments or SDEs. And these are like, those highly controlled environments where researchers can actually access and analyze sensitive data. Why is it so important to have like a UK-wide system for standards and accreditation for those?
Well, I think as the use of SDEs actually expands, it's really crucial to make sure that they are all operating at this really high level of, security and trustworthiness. And right now, there's actually quite a bit of variation, and that can create uncertainty for researchers and, for the public as well.
So it's almost like, having that quality assurance mark, like it signals a certain level of rigor and adherence to best practices.
Precisely. And this UK-wide system, for standards and accreditation, it would give everyone, researchers, policymakers, the public, that confidence that the data is being handled responsibly, no matter which SDE is actually being used.
So it's kind of like creating a level playing field and ensuring consistency across the board. I mean, I'm really starting to see how all these recommendations like kind of fit together, right? It's about creating this data ecosystem that's not just efficient and innovative, but also ethical and trustworthy.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. The Sudlow review is calling for this fundamental shift in how we actually think about and manage health data in the UK. It's recognizing the huge potential that data has to actually transform healthcare,
Right.
but also making sure that it's actually used in a way that, respects individual rights and builds that public trust.
It's about finding that sweet spot between, progress and responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we've unpacked a lot here in part 2, but I'm sure there's still plenty of questions and, challenges to consider.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think in part 3, we can explore some of the, the potential pitfalls and kind of weigh the benefits of getting this right versus the risks if we actually get it wrong.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the Sudlow review.
So we've spent a lot of time exploring this, ambitious vision for the future of health data in the UK. But as with any kind of, major undertaking, I think there are potential pitfalls that we do need to acknowledge.
Right. I mean, it's easy to kind of get swept up in all the, excitement of what data can do. But I think we also need to be realistic about the challenges and the risks involved as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest hurdles, and we've kind of touched upon this already, is just the sheer complexity of the existing health data landscape. Data is currently scattered across all these different organizations and systems using different, standards, protocols, and trying to bring all of that together in a way that is, coherent and efficient. That's a monumental task.
It's like a huge puzzle, right? Where all the pieces are different shapes.
Yeah. And not only does that create, huge logistical headaches, but it can also lead to inconsistencies and errors in the data, which could then undermine, the validity of any research findings.
So it's not just about connecting the dots. It's also about making sure that the dots themselves are reliable.
Yeah. And another challenge that we should be mindful of is the potential for, unintended consequences. For example, if we streamline access to data, it could actually inadvertently lead to, researchers cherry picking data sets or, focusing on certain populations, which could then skew the findings or even exacerbate, existing health inequalities.
Right. So it's about making sure that access is equitable and that the data is being used responsibly to benefit, everyone, not just, the people who are easiest to study or, the ones that are most likely to generate, positive results.
Exactly. We also need to be cautious about over-reliance on data and algorithms. While data can obviously provide these, invaluable insights, it's important to remember that it's just one piece of the puzzle. And things like, clinical judgment, patient input, and, ethical considerations, they should always be at the center of, healthcare decision-making.
So it's really about finding that balance between data-driven insights and human-centered care, right? It's not, the data shouldn't be dictating. It should be informing,
Yeah. And of course, there's the ever-present issue of data security and privacy. And, no matter how secure a system is, there's always that risk of breaches or misuse. So we always need to be vigilant and proactive in safeguarding, that sensitive information.
Especially as, technology advances, right? There are always new threats emerging. So it's an ongoing arms race.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that we're staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah, for sure. And the review stresses, the need for really robust cybersecurity measures, continuous monitoring, and, regular audits as well, just to make sure that the data is protected at every single level.
It's about building this whole culture of security, right?
Yeah.
Where everyone involved just understands the importance of, protecting that data and feels empowered to actually report any potential vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And I think beyond, the technical safeguards, we also need to think about those ethical implications of data use as well. So, for instance, how do we make sure that data isn't being used to, discriminate against particular groups or even to erode, individual privacy?
Right. Those are really big questions. And I don't think there are any easy answers, right? The review does call for, continuous ethical review and oversight, just to make sure that the data is being used in a way that actually aligns with societal values and respects individual rights.
Yeah, and that involves having those, sometimes quite difficult conversations and being really transparent about the trade-offs, that are involved in data use.
Yeah.
There's no perfect system, but we should always try to make it as, fair and equitable as possible.
And that takes constant dialogue, right? And collaboration between, researchers and policymakers, ethicists, the public. It's not something that can just be solved in a vacuum.
I completely agree. The future of health data. It's something that we need to shape together.
Yeah. So I think, despite those challenges, the Sudlow Review really does offer this roadmap for a more data-driven but also trustworthy future for health in the UK.
Yeah, it does. It's definitely an ambitious vision, but it also acknowledges, those complexities and those potential pitfalls. And I think ultimately the success of this whole endeavor, it really hinges on, our collective commitment to collaboration, to transparency, and to responsibility.
It's a call to action for all of us, right? To actually engage in this really important conversation and to work together to make sure that data is being used to actually improve lives and, create a healthier future for everyone.
I think you've summed it up perfectly. The future of health data, it's really in our head.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Sudlow Review. We've covered a lot today. We've talked about, the potential benefits, the challenges, and the ethical considerations of using health data to advance research and improve healthcare. And, we really hope that this has given you a better understanding of this really important topic. And hopefully it's inspired you to think a bit more critically about the role of data in shaping the future of health.
It's been a real pleasure discussing this with you.
If you're interested in learning more, you can find a link to the full Sudlow Review in the show notes. Until next time, keep diving deep.